in many countries, we've gotten thousands of letters and text messages. In Ethiopia, we got a letter from a woman in southern Ethiopia saying, "Thank you for dealing with the issue of marriage by abduction. Our own daughter was abducted on her way to school at age 14 and ended up being married as a result. So once a girl has been raped, she's often forced into marriage to save the family name and lives with her rapist." And she said, "We had been afraid to send our 12-year-old girls to school for fear the same thing would happen to them. When your program addressed this issue through the character Wubalam, our entire village, most of whom were listening, came together, and we agreed to enforce the law against marriage by abduction, which we had not realized existed. And now it's safe for our 12-year-old girls to go to school. Please keep your program on the air."
Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. Population Media Center is a US nonprofit that uses powerful storytelling to advocate for rights of women and girls, protection of the environment, and for a sustainable population. Through mass media TV and radio shows, they reach huge audiences and draw attention to important issues such as family planning, gender equality, domestic violence, girls' education, female genital mutilation, child health and education, HIV and AIDS, and conservation. Since 1998, their 40 shows that have aired in more than 50 countries have helped more than 500 million people live healthier lives. In this episode, I'm going to talk to Bill Ryerson, PMC's founder and president, who has more than 50 years of experience working in the field of reproductive health, including 3 decades of experience with social and behavior change communications. Bill, welcome to Nature Solutionaries.
Veronica, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. Population Media Center is well known to the listeners of this podcast because you're my podcast partner. So today we're going to talk about the important work that you do. And I'd like to start with the following question. I noticed that many conservationists and environmental activists believe that when they raise awareness about a critically endangered species or about a certain cause, let's say plastic pollution or overfishing, people will automatically change their attitudes and start protecting nature more. What do you think? Do you think that just giving people information and educating them is enough to achieve change?
There's a good deal of evidence that information is quite ineffective at changing behavior. And this comes in part from the world of public health, where for years people have been telling listeners to use a bed net or wear a condom or do other things without much impact on behavior. And it's certainly the case that some people are influenced by information, but more often they just take it in and then forget about it because information inherently is not motivating for most people. What motivates people emotionally is, among other things, wanting to fit into the world around them, wanting to be liked and accepted. And so, in fact, role modeling is far more influential than information. And we know this from numerous studies. There's a whole body of work by a Stanford psychologist named Albert Bandura, who died just a few months ago, but who for decades really revolutionized thinking within the world of psychology with regard to how people model their behavior after role models, whether they're parents, peers, celebrities, or fictional characters, and how those role models influence people into thinking new norms exist, and how these role models can also convince people that change is possible. So if you think change is impossible, you will often not attempt any type of change. But if you gain what Bandura called self-efficacy through a role model, that is the belief that one has both the ability and the right to accomplish some new task, then you may be much more likely to attempt that new task. So a girl growing up seeing a female prime minister may suddenly think that, in fact, doing something like leading a government is possible for women. And so role models that people identify with are critically important in shaping how society evolves. So in fact, I have nothing against information by itself. When you think about Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, it was very powerful information. But in fact, by the time I finished watching it, and I've watched it several times, I did not know what to do about the crisis he was describing. It just made me want to get out a bottle of wine because it seemed so hopeless. But in fact, what would be much more useful following that type of information is some concrete role modeling on what one can do, and doing it in a way that is not preaching to people, but just showing and having somebody who's a charismatic role model show new behaviors in a way that makes them not only acceptable, but motivational to the viewer.
When there is so much scientific knowledge about the impact of these role models and about the fact that information by itself doesn't really influence people's behavior, why do so many organizations or governments still feel that just raising awareness is enough? Why don't they adopt this new paradigm?
That's a very good question. Maybe we haven't role modeled adequately to environmental leaders, but there are some environmental organizations that I think understand the power of role modeling. For example, Population Media Center has worked in partnership with the Jane Goodall Institute in Eastern Congo, role modeling stopping the use of bushmeat as a way to help preserve wildlife and also to protect people's health. And that was far more influential than just telling people don't eat bushmeat, because they say, well, I like it and why should I not eat it? And so, in fact, some organizations are discovering this, but it is far easier just to give people information. When you think about everything you've read about the climate crisis in the last 5 years, I would guess that 90% of it has been trying to turn the reader into a climate expert. But in fact, I can be a climate expert and still not change my behavior. If somebody I have high regard for, or maybe to put it in stronger terms, somebody I'm in love with, demonstrates how they have changed their carbon footprint and why that is, to use a slang term, sexy, that might be far more motivating for me than just hearing that we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In the same way that if my cardiologist tells me to go to the gym, that may have less effect than if Jane Fonda calls me and invites me to join her at the gym.
Yeah, you're probably right. And that's what I try to do in my work, to showcase the stories of people who are doing something to give other people hope that they can follow their example. So it's a nice confirmation for me. Thank you. And you also use a lot of storytelling in your work, right? And
yes.
How do you combine the role modeling with storytelling?
When you think about most of human history, education was done through storytelling. And storytelling can be very powerful if the stories are done in a way that builds emotional involvement. So back in the 1970s, when Bandura was still a young man at Stanford, but had come up with his social learning theory and social cognitive theory, a telenovela producer from Mexico named Miguel Sabido, who had become curious about the effects of his programs on the audience beyond selling products, which was the purpose of commercial television, such as influencing hairstyle and clothing style of viewers because of the characters. This man, Miguel Sabido, went to see Albert Bandura and interviewed him on how is it possible that my audience is copying the behaviors of the characters and why are they doing this? And created, based on that interview and a lot of reading, not only of Bandura's work, but other work related to both communications theory and the function of the brain. For example, the work of Paul MacLean, who found that most behavioral decisions by humans are made in the parts of the brain that deal primarily with emotion, not the parts that are primarily dealing with rational thought. He created a whole methodology for the use of telenovelas for social change. And he created very charismatic characters in a telenovela in 1974 that were dealing with the poverty and social implications of illiteracy. And so some of the people were young people who had been bypassed by formal education. Some of them were elderly and who had never learned to read and write. And he found through his research
I'd
that
like to thank the Population Media Center
these
for supporting this
Mexicans
podcast
were
episode through their social media
talking about
and
finally learning
newsletter.
to read
Thank
and
you
write.
very much.
People would say, no, you're too old, you're too stupid, forget about it, learn to live with your poverty. And so he created negative characters who gave illiterate characters in this telenovela that message. And he created positive characters who said, of course, you can overcome your poverty, you can learn to read and write, you were just bypassed by formal education, but it's not too late. In fact, Mexico has an adult education program that you can attend the classes of free of charge in the evenings after work, and you can learn to read and write and better your lot in life. And so over a 1 year, 5-night-a-week telenovela, so 260 episodes, these characters, one by one, decided, okay, let me sign up for this program. And they struggled through the classes. They sometimes dropped out because it was difficult. So he painted a realistic picture, but they all came back and finished and got their diplomas. And near the end of the serial, the most popular character turned out to be a grandfather figure who had a box full of letters from his granddaughter that he had never been able to read. And he went through the classes. And near the last few weeks of the serial, there was a graduation event where he got his diploma. And he broke down in tears of joy that he could finally read all the letters from his granddaughter. And Sabido decided, let me follow this episode by having somebody read aloud the addresses of registration sites for adult education classes across Mexico. So he set that up, and then he called the Ministry of Public Education and said, you may be aware of the program I have on Televisa called Ven Conmigo that's dealing with adult education. And it's based on having run public service announcements from your ministry on our air. I thought maybe I could contribute to getting people to sign up for classes through this program. And they said, yes, we know the program very much. It's reinforcing our public service announcements. Thank you very much. And he said, well, I'm planning to run an upcoming episode that will be very emotional and that will be followed by basically an advertisement giving addresses of your registration sites. Can you handle a crowd? And they said, oh, no problem. Last year we signed up 99,000 people who responded to our public service announcements. So he ran that episode. The following day, 250,000 people showed up in a single day to register.
Wow.
He continued to run the advertisement following the remaining episodes for the last few weeks of the program. By the time the program ended, 840,000 people had signed up for adult education, more than 8 times the entire year before. So Sabito had, through that experiment, showed that, in fact, you can have a huge audience. In his case, being in commercial television, that was the number one goal. And he had 33% of the nation's viewers watching the program. It was far more popular than pure entertainment programs that had preceded it because it dealt with an issue people cared about, but it didn't bore them. It dealt with their lives in a way that they related to through these characters. And by the end of the program, he had done a huge amount of good for Mexican society at the same time. So it's possible to combine positive role modeling with an entertainment program in a commercial context. And that's one of the things that we've been very much trying to help Hollywood and other people in the media understand, that, in fact, you don't have to just use sex and violence as a way to attract audiences. You can model positive behavior if you do it in a way that doesn't bore the audience. Sabito, having dealt with adult education with huge success, decided in 1976 to do another telenovela addressing family planning. Mexico 3 years earlier had legalized contraception. That program was accompanied by a 33% increase in clinic attendance and a 23% increase in the sale of contraceptives in pharmacies. Sabito also role modeled advocacy. So characters who had discovered the benefit of family planning advocated among characters who had not that they should consider use of family planning. And then he ran a unique toll-free number people could call if they wanted to sign up as volunteer promoters, and 3,000 people called to sign up. So he really, with that program, began my thinking about the fact that just telling people that population is growing by 83 million a year is not effective at changing behavior. People are not deciding on family size based on global demographic trends. So, in fact, Sabito did 5 such programs dealing with family decision-making, including teenage pregnancy prevention and other issues that he addressed in the late 70s and early 80s. And by the time those programs had run, Mexico had achieved the most dramatic decline in fertility rate of any developing country in the 20th century up until that time. And that earned Mexico the UN Population Prize in 1986.
How is the situation nowadays when it's kind of a taboo to talk about the growing population? Can you see any programs similar to what Sabito did in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or the countries where the population growth is the highest?
There are other programs because there are other organizations that have seen the impact of our programs and have started doing similar things. So I can point to several organizations, some inspired originally by Sabito, like Soul City in South Africa. Johns Hopkins University does some of these types of programs. BBC, World Service, not the BBC itself, but an NGO spinoff of the BBC, has done some of these types of programs. So yes, there are other organizations, and the issue is not one where population is the topic of the program. As I said, people are not deciding family size based on demographic issues. So when you are listening to or watching a serial drama that's dealing with real life decisions of marital relationships and family size decision making for many young people and young adults, this is a very interesting topic, and it need not have anything to do with sustainability or global demographic trends. Educating people on biodiversity is less important than helping them understand how to have a healthy and economically successful life. And so modeling decisions about delayed marriage, girls' education, spacing of childbearing, use of contraception, and other issues that intersect with the bigger issue of sustainability is what is needed in order to bring us to a point where the planet does become sustainable. Most people who are not using contraception, when they're asked why not, don't give lack of access as the reason. They give fear of health effects, male opposition, religious opposition, even fatalism. They believe that they don't have anything to say about the number of children they have. That's up to God. And so overcoming cultural and misinformation factors is critically important. So that's what these programs using positive, negative, and transitional characters are able to do.
Could we now analyze one of your recent shows? I would like to understand how it's made and how it impacts the people. So just think of one case study or one recent show which has had an impact, and let's analyze it a bit. So before creating a show, I imagine that you need to pick a place where to air it. So how do you do that? How do you decide where to do that and what topic to focus on?
First of all, the key issue in airing any program is language. So in 2013, the Gates Foundation invited me to visit Zambia for a conference dealing with HIV prevention. And they had people from the advertising world and me from the entertainment education world talking about strategies for changing behavior. And advertising obviously is an effective way to change behavior when you're selling products. But if you listen to a 30-second ad telling you to send your daughter to school, if you believe that a girl's place is to be sold into marriage at 15, is probably ineffective, whereas role modeling can get somebody through a longer transition on an ingrained behavior. So at any rate, while I was there, I talked to various people, and to make a long story short, we ended up receiving a grant from USAID for 2 programs in Zambia. So then we said, okay, where do we do these programs? And we analyzed the map of where each language is spoken, and we chose 2 parts of the country where there were high rates of teen pregnancy, high rates of school dropout, particularly of girls, in part because of teen pregnancy, and very high fertility rate and low use of contraception. And we went on the air with these 2 programs. In English, one was called Breaking the Barrier, and the other was called Over the Horizon. And they broadcast in Lozi and Bemba speaking parts of the country. We had about just under half of the population listening to any number of episodes, and 37% of the population reporting listening at least weekly. So that's a big audience in any country.
And how big are these populations? In millions or in hundreds of thousands?
Well, the population of listeners was just under 1 million people, of regular listeners. People who had ever listened was just over 1 million people. So yeah, it was a sizable number of people. And, it's important to understand when one is looking at social change, not everybody changes at once. There's a book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point that shows how a minor trend can tip over to be the major norm. And it starts with people who are early adopters, I guess is the term that I would use. And, the people who are networkers, who are highly visible, like religious leaders and community leaders and political leaders, the people who are salespeople, the people who are experts often influence large numbers of others. And so, in fact, in changing norms, if one influences 1 million people to adopt new behaviors, it can then have a ripple effect over time in the society as people see, oh, well, these people are doing better financially, they're in better health, their children are going to school, let me try that. So our listeners were 1.6 times as likely as non-listeners in Zambia after running these controls to say, yes, I'm using a method of family planning. So clearly had an impact on the uptake of family planning. With regard to, have you heard a program supported by the US government containing family planning content? Our listeners were 37 times as likely as non-listeners to answer yes. Now, that, of course, was because our program was one of the few things being supported by the US government, modeling family planning use, but there were others. But indeed, our program was attracting a huge audience who voluntarily were tuning in because they were being entertained as opposed to being lectured at, with people telling them about methods of family planning. So in many ways, this strategy doesn't deal with the details about contraceptive methods and how they work. It deals with the why of family planning. Why do you want to space children at least 3 years apart for better child health and for better maternal health? Why do you want to have your daughters go to school as opposed to getting married at 15? Why do you want to have women free of violence in the home? And once people go, oh, yes, let me do that, then the how is much easier. But so much of the messaging on health issues in general is about the how before people ever get to the why.
I know that you're doing ethnographic research before creating and scripting the show. So during this ethnographic research, do you ask the local people, like do you do questionnaires, or do you ask them in person what they need, what they want?
Great question. Yes. And this is critically important for communications that are effective. If one just goes in and designs a program without knowing the audience, they can really miss the mark. It can even backfire. So we do extensive quantitative and qualitative research. We interview cultural experts. We understand what people are eating for breakfast. We understand what they wear. We understand all aspects of their lives. And we particularly focus on the concerns they have, the issues that they're dealing with, and we address those issues in the program. We do that in the context of also understanding what the government policies are with regard to these issues. So our writers and our country teams, all of whom are country nationals, understand the policy framework within which they're operating. So we're not advocating or modeling something that is outside the policy. Now, most health policies in most countries are quite positive. So we base all of our programs on those policies. The only exception is if the policies counter UN agreements or human rights accords, and then we don't address those policies. But with most policies, governments are encouraging child spacing and use of family planning and other goals. So we actually create a formal document, and we use that plus the formative research among audience members to make a presentation to the government about this is what this program will address. These are the values it will hold, and these values are based on these policies of your government. And so the governments are very enthusiastic because they've been struggling for years to get people to avoid HIV infection and to use family planning. And these programs have such an impact that they are thrilled to have such a program being done. So we've done this with full collaboration with the government in every country.
Okay, wow, I didn't know that. And so after you do this ethnographic research and after you have the confirmation from the government that they want to help you air this show, what happens next? How long does it take to create the show, and how many local writers or actors are engaged?
For each language program, we'll train 10 to 15 writers, and we will hire as permanent writers for the program about 5. But we build capacity beyond that, in part for self-interest in case we lose a writer in the process if somebody goes off to university or something. And we will, after doing the formative research, hold a 3-week workshop in which details of the formative research, including listening to interviews and even sometimes the writers having one-on-one conversations with potential audience members to give them storyline ideas. So for several days, they'll learn about the research findings with regard to the people that the program is intended to reach. And then they will get a presentation on the Sabito methodology Miguel Sabito originally created, and the way it's been adapted by Population Media Center to not only new media, but old media. So it started in television, but it's now in radio in countries where radio is the dominant medium, but also social media, WhatsApp, and other applications where such content can be accessed by people, particularly in urban areas. So we do that type of training. And then the writers spend a good deal of time creating values, positive and negative, and middle of the road values with regard to each issue to be addressed based on the policy framework of that government. So, the positive value might be to send the daughter to school. The negative value might be held by a negative character that says, no, that's expensive and they become mothers anyway, so why bother, just sell them into marriage. And so you set up these conflicts between characters who represent the spectrum of views within that country, and then characters who are just like the audience, who are being impacted by the positive and negative attitudes, just like we all are in life. And they then plot out how the transitional character will evolve and what the pushback will be, and have that transitional character show how to deal with the pushback, and also what the consequences, realistic consequences for the negative characters will be of their behavior, as well as the consequences for the positive characters who are the role model, the positive role models for the transitional characters. But it's amazingly, it's the transitional characters, not the positive characters, who are most influential with the audience. And so as people fall in love with these transitional characters, that we find they start naming their children after.
Really?
They start writing letters to them saying, so-and-so is cheating on you. You may not know that, but you need to be careful. And so we get that kind of feedback from our audience all the time. And that can, in fact, influence the script, because we don't write the whole program in advance. We write 30 episodes in advance and produce it and go on the air. And as the program evolves, feedback from the audience and events going on in the life of the country can be built into the storyline in a way that makes it even more realistic to the audience. So, for example, one of these programs in the Philippines occurred during the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. And so the program built in people living in a refugee camp that had been displaced by the eruption. And it was a central part of the storyline after a while. So it's, the programs become very realistic. So at any rate, the storyline is sketched out in general part in terms of how these characters are going to evolve, the transitional characters, and how they're going to deal with the issues that will be thrown at them. And another aspect of writing these programs is creating settings. So not everybody is urban or rural. So we create rural, urban, and peri-urban settings. So everybody in the audience has characters they can relate to. And in those different settings, the characters hold different values and deal with different issues. And so, in fact, the plot emerges, in a sense, based on the values of the characters in each setting. So if you imagine the neighborhood in which you live, the people who are your neighbors were not preordained by some writer to hold this view or that view. They are who they are, and how you and they interact is organic in the way that reflects the values and the personalities of those people.
And this is exactly what Hollywood doesn't do, because it only portrays either New York or Los Angeles, as if the whole Midwest and no other parts of America existed. So I don't know, like, at least for people, for me, I'm European, so I watch American films. It seems like there is nothing else. There is either New York or Los Angeles, and so you're doing the right thing, because I can't become very familiar with someone living in New York because I live in a small town. So yeah. And
we're planning a program in America about the lives of people in Appalachia, and it is certainly the case that television in the U.S. is very biased towards those two big cities. I once had somebody in Africa, I showed them a picture of the grass in our backyard, and they said, I thought all of America was paved. I didn't know there was any plants growing there.
And so who are these people who are writing the stories? Because what fascinates me is that you don't just put the educational aspect there, but it's actually a lot of fun, and it's thrilling, and it keeps the people watching it or listening it. So these must be real professionals writing it.
They are real professionals. When we began working in any country, we begin a search for real creative talent. And we look at the playwrights who are doing plays at the National Theater. We look at people in the drama department of the National University. We look at authors of books and other creative people who could possibly become writers of a serialized drama. And indeed, if there are serialized dramas, we look at those writers. And we interview lots of them. We may interview 40 people, and we will choose maybe 15 to train. They benefit from the training and sometimes get jobs using that training, even if we don't hire them. But these are very talented scriptwriters who know how to create a good, juicy, suspenseful storyline. If it's not suspenseful, people don't tune in after one episode. Suspense gets people to come back to see what happened. And so we create suspense at the end of every scene and every episode. And in a typical design in a radio drama, there'll be a 15-minute episode with 3 different scenes, 5 minutes each, set in 3 different settings. And there are interactions of the characters in the different settings. So there are characters who travel back and forth. So it all ties together. But over time, the audience is eavesdropping on the lives of these characters as they're going through all kinds of trials and tribulations and changes of life fortune. And in any setting, there will be some major change of life fortune going on at one time, so that the audience is always excited to hear how that's going to turn out.
And do you sometimes run the shows more times, or do you only produce it once and then?
We do run it more times. We have found not everybody can drop everything and listen to a program at a particular time. So even when we do original broadcasting, we may do it in several time slots, but then we can rerun it. We can put it on a website where people can listen to it on their cell phones. And we have done a lot of rebroadcasting of programs. So yeah, these products, which we have, all of these 40 plus programs are, a lot of them are in constant use. Now they may get dated. So over time, they may need some updating, but they remain highly influential when we use them again.
And I suppose that these programs are local, right? So a show that was broadcasted in Burkina Faso will not be so relevant for Zambia.
That's correct. If you think about cultures that are very different from your own, if you see somebody, let's say, set in India and wearing sari and dealing with Indian food, you say, well, that's someplace else. That's not where I live. So I may not relate to that as much as I would if it's somebody who's just like me. And of course, language, and within language, slang and phraseology is very important. So the closer you can make it to the cultural reality of the listener, the more impactful it will be. So in fact, these programs are all written originally in the local language. We don't write anything in English and translate it. We write them in the local language.
And is it expensive to produce these shows?
Yes and no. As I said, the cost per person who changes behavior can be very low. I mean, that example from Tanzania, it was 32 cents. Most recently in northern Nigeria, the cost of a 208 episode program across 4 northern Nigerian states per person who adopted family planning and attributed it to the program was 30 cents US. So they're inexpensive in that regard, but writing and hiring actors and producing 200 episodes, buying primetime airtime to broadcast them across a country or a language region is expensive. It's typically for us in a African context, about $1.8 million over 3 years. But because these programs attract such huge audiences and have such huge impact, they are the most cost-effective strategy we have found. Doing billboards and posters and brochures is much less expensive in terms of the dollar outlay, but in fact, the cost per behavior change is so high, it's actually less cost-effective than doing a serialized drama.
And who pays for these shows? The donors or sometimes even the governments?
We have had governments pay for them, but that's rare in low-income countries. So the government of Ethiopia has sponsored one of our programs, and that was done with funds they received from the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS prevention. But most times it is the donors, and the donors consist of individuals. We have had single individuals fund Hollywood shows. We did a show dealing with teen pregnancy among Hispanic teens, which have the highest rate of teen pregnancy in the US. And it was primarily the support of one individual that made that possible, although the Ford Foundation and the California Wellness Foundation and a few others got on board with that program, but it was primarily an individual. So we do have some individuals who have recognized this approach is hugely impactful and have supported it. But we also have support from 9 different governments and from UN agencies like UN Population Fund and UNICEF, World Health Organization, UN Women, World Food Program. We've dealt with nutrition in countries like Zambia and Burundi, and we've had support from many UN agencies. And many foundations have supported our work internationally as well. So we have a nice mix of donors supporting this work. And because we're trying to reach the poorest of the poor, advertising support has been less of a source of support for this than philanthropy, because the advertisers want to reach the urbanites who can afford to buy their products, whereas a radio serial drama in a place like Zambia or Ethiopia may be reaching the very poor rural population who are primarily dependent on radio. So there is some advertising support, but it's minimal compared to donor support.
Thank you for this answer. Now I'll jump somewhere else a little bit. I would like to know about the impact of the shows. So how long does it take for the show to have an impact on the person? I have a few examples here, so I'll just quote the first one. Your show Ruandare, which aired between 2007 and 2009 in 4 northwest states of Nigeria, reached an estimated number of 12.3 million loyal listeners, which is over 70% of the population. And it catalyzed 1.1 million new family planning users. So this is a great impact. And I'm wondering, do you think that these 1.1 million people will keep on using family planning programs throughout their lives, or is it just an impact of the one show and then maybe they will change their mind or be influenced by the social norms?
It's a complicated answer, but I think the short answer is, for many people who change behavior, the benefits are so evident that they never go back to the old norm. When Sabito stopped doing social content programming, the birth rate in Mexico did not go back up. It was a permanent change. And we have seen in countries where we have been operating a long time, like Ethiopia, where fertility rates declined dramatically and contraceptive use, particularly among our listeners, increased dramatically, that the population has not reverted to old behavior. Now, you can imagine in a hypothetical example where we do a 2-year program and then we shut down, and there are countervailing messages from the conservative side of the culture, it may push people back. So in fact, changing norms, number one, takes time and deserves a consistent approach over a 20-year period. So in Nigeria, for example, Nigeria's health indicators, despite Ruandare, huge effect, they won't reach the health indicators of Norway within 2 years. They've got a long way to go, and a lot of people need to be reached. Yes, we had a huge success there, but there are many people who didn't hear the program, 30% of the population in the broadcast area, and then there's the whole rest of Nigeria. So our number one goal is wherever we are in operation to stay there long term. But the best indication we have, even without adequate long-term research, is that for most people, the effects of these programs is permanent. They realize from the benefits of their now modeling their behavior after these characters that their own lives are dramatically improving. And again, as I mentioned with the letter from the woman in Ethiopia, we get thousands of communications from listeners telling us how their lives have improved. So, for example, in Zambia, one of our listeners, a man, lived a 3-day walk away from the radio station he was listening to. And the walk included crossing a forest that was populated with wild animals. But he entered a contest and won a T-shirt that had the name of the program on it. He walked 3 days through the national forest to get his T-shirt and walked back home, and then reformed his own family life. He had been domineering with his wife to the point of almost abuse. He set up a group to discuss egalitarian family life. He became a leader in his community based on this program. So this man is not likely to go back to his old ways. I mean, the commitment from him is just one example of how, when people find out that, in fact, God hasn't determined how many children you're going to have, it's up to you, you can actually have a hugely liberating experience and have a total change in your life going forward.
This is a very moving story. Yeah, I'm very impressed. You mentioned some of the challenges, for example, religious beliefs. So have you also had any criticism for your shows?
Not public. We designed the programs in a way that does not create controversy. So you probably know the name Gloria Steinem, a feminist leader in the United States. She's on our program advisory board. And I've often said, parachuting a feminist leader from the United States into Sudan would not necessarily be a way to get the Sudanese population to adopt feminist values, because it may be too radical a step. It is easier to bring about permanent change without backlash in baby steps. So we work very hard to have our transitional characters evolve in baby steps. They don't go from being subservient women to entrepreneurs overnight. They, like most people, take some time to change their own views. And that makes it easier for the audience to make the transition with them, because, first of all, we want the audience in love with them. And then at each step as they change, the audience has to understand the rationale for the new behavior and, in a sense, has to forgive the character for trying something non-traditional. So if we do it too fast, the radio gets switched off and people get angry. So, in fact, we've had no public controversy over these programs. We have had, for example, in northern Nigeria, one Islamic leader write to his superior saying, this program is promoting family planning and that's not Islamic, and so we think it should be taken off the air. And we had a meeting with his superior and explained the official finding from Al-Aram University in Cairo that finds that while the Quran was written 700 years ago and doesn't mention family planning, it does command women to breastfeed their infants for at least 2 years. And if one becomes pregnant in a country like Nigeria, it can interrupt breastfeeding. And so this official finding says, therefore, the Quran inherently endorses family planning. So when the imam knew this, he explained this to this other religious leader, and that ended it. So indeed, there have been no public opposition to our programs anywhere.
Interesting. So are there any other challenges?
The biggest challenge in running a nonprofit organization is finding funding.
The usual answer, yes.
Sadly, is the greatest limiting factor. You know, we would love to be on the air in 50 countries all the time. We're not, because it is difficult to find funding, even though it's very clear that this strategy for what is not a whole lot of money, even in international development terms, could do a huge amount to help the planet achieve sustainability, peace, and harmony. It's really, I can't think of anything that's more important than giving people correct information through an accessible means like role modeling. And yet, for many donors, they see communications as something that's secondary in importance to building bridges or dams or doing other things that they can point to. So communications is still a tough sell in international development. It's way underutilized. That is the biggest limiting factor.
But even if you show them the data, they are resistant?
That's how we've gotten most of the support we've gotten. So the data does impress people because we have data now from numerous countries. And so donors who want to bring about change have said, yes, let me do this. And so indeed, it's growing. That's certainly the case. We have had growing support and interest. We have, for example, now a long-term agreement with UNICEF globally because they're so impressed by the work we do. So we have had growing acceptance, but it's always a struggle, particularly when there are other things going on that demand money.
Yeah, but as you said, you need to do it with baby steps.
Yes, true.
It's also applicable to your work.
And when you think about donors, they're like the rest of us. They look to role models. So the fact that a colleague from another country in the same organization or the same embassy has done this and achieved great success can influence a donor in any country to say, oh, yes, let me try this.
So one of my last questions would be, what is the most important lesson that you have learned over the 50 years in the field of reproductive health and social and behavior change communications?
We've analyzed the data from the demographic and health surveys in 95 countries where they have been conducted. And these are demographic surveys that are carried out pretty much every 5 years. And the top reasons for non-use of family planning by the 225 million women who don't want a pregnancy and are not using a method, as well as the much larger number who are not using family planning because they want a pregnancy, have to do with desired family size, fear of health effects, male opposition, religious opposition, and fatalism. And so much of the world community has focused on building clinics and creating new methods, while lack of access is not the primary barrier to use of this hugely important health innovation of contraception. It's probably the most important form of health progress in maternal health in particular that has ever occurred. And we've gone from 10% of the world's couples using methods of contraception in 1960 to 57% today, but the 47% non-users of contraception outnumber the 90% non-users from 1960 because of population growth. So there's a huge amount to be done, but now the reasons for non-use have little to do with lack of access to services as they did in 1960. They have to do with these informational barriers, like intentional misinformation about safety of contraception put out by people who are opposed to contraception for reasons like their religion. So it's critically important to use effective communication strategies to address this issue and most other issues that affect the human endeavor. Without communications, if we just think infrastructure is going to do it all, we are fooling ourselves. And communications is central to human progress.
That's really important. And I think that still many people are not aware of it. At least that's what I see in many articles and discussions. They always refer to the lack of access to, but not so much to the cultural and social norms and other barriers.
Yes.
So it's been wonderful talking to you, also very inspiring, and I learned a lot of new information. Thank you, Bill, and I wish you good luck with finding donors who will fund your shows.
Veronica, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Nature Solutionaries. If you like this episode and think your network might be interested, please help spread the word on social media. And if you don't want to miss another episode, you can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. If you enjoy this podcast, please write a review. This helps other people find the show and learn about the most important conservation efforts of today. For more podcasts, visit veronicaperkova.com/naturesolutionaries. I'm Veronica Perkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.